When we think about religion and violence, a technique for doing that, particularly by sort of political theorists and others, people like Hobbes, would look towards a state of nature, an imaginary world almost, trying to understand how first causes happened. And I want to introduce you to somebody else who does that. A French philosopher, sort of literary critic, somebody called René Girard, and his book Violence and the Sacred. In the book, he's claiming that religion is linked to violence, but it comes after violence. So when we think about most wars are caused by religion, clearly Girard would have a very different take on that. So yes, there's violence in the world, but religion is introduced to try and mitigate and control endemic violence, to stop things going, in Hobbes's expression, life being nasty, brutish and short, of all against all. And the way he does that is by suggesting that violence is a product of something called mimetic rivalry. And what does he mean by that? Mimetic, from sort of imitating. What he's meaning and what he's getting at is that there's no such thing as spontaneous desire or even individual autonomy. Only the desire or the need to imitate others. Okay, just to unpack that a little bit more, what he envisages is a triangulation almost of self, other, and the object of desire. The only reason that that object is an object of desire for the self is that the other also desires that, or says it's worth having. And that's what propels the self to want other things. So in terms of our fashion choices, we've made some disastrous fashion choices over the years, but we're making those choices because we see other people making those choices as well. And that sort of gives us the signal that that is something which is to be desired. And that's at a very superficial level. But if you are thinking about land, if you're thinking about individuals, then the attractiveness of the individual increases to the extent to which others also find that person attractive. The land which is wanted, or whatever object you can imagine, we desire that because other people desire that as well. Now that's fine, as long as there's enough to go round. But the reality, we live in a world with finite resources, and there's scarcity of resources. Now, where there's scarce resources and competing interests with those scarce resources, what happens is that power comes into play and violence can ensue to make sure that the strongest, the fittest, actually acquire those scarce resources. And that leading to violence is something which needs to be mitigated, because you have a situation then when society is completely undermined because of this sort of cycle of violence which can ensue. This is where religion comes in, as Girard suggests that religion is there. It merges to control that violence through the community. And it seeks to avoid the violence between the self and the other third party. And it does that through a system of sacrifice. So we see in early religions sacrifices being made to the gods. And that sacrifice satisfies the gods, but also involves a covenant between the people who are involved. in that they recognise that in making that sacrifice, they are surrendering their sort of ambitions, as were their own sort of conflict, and they're allowing that to go towards a sacrifice. And here Girard sort of introduces the idea of the scapegoat mechanism. A scapegoat is basically sort of derives from Leviticus in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, whereby the sins of the people were mitigated by the priests laying hands on a goat and then driving the goat out from their midst, escaping, hence scapegoat. And this mechanism breaks the contagion of profane violence. It's this use of a third party, the animal sacrifice, initially, that you can blame all the ills of society, or you lay the ills of society onto that animal and drive it out into the wilderness. This begins then to morph into sort of beyond just animal sacrifices or the idea of the scapegoat, the goat going out into the wilderness, to actually finding other scapegoats. And those other scapegoats are usually minority groups. They need to be sufficiently like the self and other that would otherwise be in conflict over mimetic desire, but sufficiently different to be able to say that this is the root of all our problems. And so, historically, minority groups have borne the brunt of societal ills, whereby the self and the other can agree that this third party is really the problem. And we see this through persecution of the Jews in particular, throughout their history, and particularly in Western Europe, culminating in the Holocaust with 6 million Jews being exterminated by the Nazis. Now, when sacrifice sort of outdoes its usefulness, as it were, and people no longer sort of believe in that or no longer use that, then in modern society, other things take its place. So the penal system takes its place, whereby crimes can be punished, the violence can be broken, rather than individuals having to take revenge for affronts to themselves or to those they love and care about. Then so that cycle of violence can be broken through the penal system, which self and other, indeed the whole community, can ascribe to. In thinking about that from a religious perspective, probably the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross at Calvary, whereby the sacrifice is made to make mankind or humanity right with God, that the sins of the world are placed upon Jesus, who's then sacrificed. But what Girard says is he moves beyond that and says, well, actually what that sacrifice was doing and saying was that sacrifice has fulfilled its purpose. It is no longer a need for that, and it exposes the nature of sacrifice, enabling us to move to a modern era where we have the penal system. So quite complex ideas, but hopefully that sort of gives you a little bit inkling into both Girard's thought, but also how we see this working out. Second aspect of what I'd like to look at today is Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Samuel Huntington, at the end of the Cold War, actually posits that the world is now, in a post-Cold War era, divided into different civilizations, and these have become the major demarcators, and our loyalties would be to those civilizations rather than communism or capitalism as such. And he defines sort of Western civilization, which he sees as sort of Judeo-Christian, Latin American civilization, the Orthodox Slavic, the Islamic civilization, Sinic, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the Japanese, and maybe he's not sure about this, but maybe the sub-Saharan African as well. And his idea was that basically these civilizations, where they meet at the borders, this is where clashes would occur, particularly between Islam and between other faiths. But this really came to a fore in 9/11, where this book suddenly becomes lifted to the #1 in the New York Times bestsellers list. And it's taken on board, not just by those people who would see Islam as being problematic, but also by those on the other side. So Osama bin Laden, for example, bought into this idea of a clash of civilizations, that there's somehow inevitability between the clash between his interpretation of Islam and what he saw as the West. People like Mohammad Khatami in Iran talked about a dialogue of civilizations. Rather than clashing, maybe they should talk to one another. But again, it's buying into this sort of dualism, really, of that clash between difference. And yet, if we look at Girard's interpretation of this, then the real issue over Islam and Christianity in Huntington's thesis is actually a matter of the similarities rather than the differences. It's this othering that can take place. So both missionary, monotheistic, universalist and conquering religions at times in their history. And those similarities rather than the differences are the things which need to be dealt with and inevitably end up in conflict. We haven't got time now to sort of go into all the details of the critique of Huntington's thesis, but bear that in mind and maybe think in terms of why that thesis is a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also the problems with that thesis.